hope you're doing well. Some of you have asked me, how do I get that sound, that kind of fake e-guitar lead sound I use for my synthwave covers, like this one right here. So today's video is going to be an in-depth tutorial on just that. So we're going to start from scratch with a blank patch, and I'm going to show you right from the beginning all the steps that are necessary to get that kind of sound. So let's dive right into it, and I'll see you after the video. Alright, so here we are in our Pro Tools session, but of course it doesn't matter which DAW you use, you can apply these principles we're about to see in any DAW virtually. So I have two tracks here, as you can see. On the first track I have the finished product, so to speak. So this is the kind of sound you're going to be able to get at the end of this tutorial, and it sounds something like this. So that's our fake lead mono solo guitar sound there. And on my second track here, I have a fresh instance of hybrid. So no sound there. And we're going to create that patch you just heard right from scratch, right from the start. Of course, you don't have to use hybrid to get this kind of sound. It's possible with virtually any soft synth out there, so long as it's able to create a sawtooth waveform, which they all are. So let me turn up the level for this second oscillator here. And this is the kind of sound that we get. Nothing special, just a sawtooth waveform. But we have already an issue here to take care of, and that is that if I play more than one note at any given moment, you know, those notes stack up. So it's a polyphonic patch. And that is perfect for pads and that sort of sound. But if we're going for a lead sound, this might actually be a problem. And here's what I mean. Like, suppose I were to play a passage like this one. Now, if I were playing in a sloppy way, I might end up with something like this. You know, with those notes stacking up, and that takes away from the tightness and clarity of the performance. So a very quick fix for this, just make sure your patch is monophonic. Problem solved. So that's the first thing. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to choose a wavetable. And again, if your synth doesn't have wavetables, no problem, just go with your sawtooth. But if you have wavetables, I would strongly suggest you check them out, because you might find one that sounds a little better maybe. And in my case, I've played around with them quite a bit, and I know that this Synctronic 1 wavetable suits my needs a little better. Not much of a change really. I think it just has a different sounding mid-range, maybe a bit. Maybe not as much high-end, which is perfect for the kind of sound we're going for. So if you have the chance to play around with some wavetables, definitely do so. If not, just go with your standard sawtooth. That won't be a problem at all. Now, moving on, I have a filter section here with your usual suspect, the standard low-pass filter. Sounds like this. Now, we're not going to use it in such an extreme fashion, but if I move over to the mod pane here, you can see that my key tracking parameter is turned all the way up. And what that does is, it's, you know, it's just a bit, but it cuts off a tiny bit of high end the further down we go with the pitch. So this note will have a little bit less high end than, say, this very high pitched note. And that, you know, makes for a more natural patch, because I'm not a guitarist, but I know that, you know, there's different strings in a guitar, and some are thicker and some are thinner. And the thinner ones tend to have more high end as opposed to the thicker ones, even if they play the same note. And so we kind of want to emulate that sort of behavior a little bit. I'm sure your software synth has that parameter as well. You just might have to look around a bit. Like in this case, it was hidden in the mod pane, but you know, it's there. I would suggest you use it. And then another thing we want to do, the third thing we want to do here before moving on, is to play around with the amp envelope. So this is basically telling the sound how to behave over time. So right now, if I press a key, we immediately hear it at full volume, and it stays there until the moment I let go. And then it just fades to 0 immediately. Just like an organ. But we're not going to emulate an organ here, we want to play guitar. And if you've had any experience playing notes on a guitar, you know that, when you hold a note, it will fade over time. And so that's what we can emulate here with the amplifier envelope. So the two parameters to take into consideration here are sustain and decay. So I'm going to give you an extreme example so you understand what we're talking about here, and then we're going to set it just right. So let me turn the sustain, as you can see down here, all the way to 0. And as for the decay time, I'm going to use a very quick one, and it sounds something like this. So no matter how long I press that key, the volume is going to go down all the way to 0 after about 400 milliseconds. So that's way too extreme a setting in our scenario here. So I think a sustained value of around 50% should work fine. And we also want to use much more decay here. So that's more like it. It's very subtle, it's very gentle. Have a look at the meter here. As you can see, the volume goes down just, a small amount at a time until it reaches 50% of what it initially was after about 10 seconds. So, another small detail we put in there to make for a more organic and rich kind of sound. So that's it for the first part. So the important points: make sure your patch is monophonic, number one. Number two, make sure you have a not a wavetable. Well, if you can have a wavetable, use it, but the important thing is that it's a sawtooth kind of waveform. Number three, on your low pass filter, make sure you have at least a bit of key track enabled. And number four, play around with the amplifier envelope and make sure that your sound decays over time a bit. So that's it for the first part. Moving on, I'm going to the effects pane here, and if your synth doesn't come with this, if you don't have any internal effects, that's not a problem at all. You can just use up the remaining slots on your track, so you can use external plugins. Your DAW probably comes with a lot of stock plugins which can do the job, and if not, you can just Google for the plugins you need, because there's just an insane amount of excellent freeware being released these days. So I'm sure you're going to find what you're looking for. So what are we looking for? We're looking for a Formant filter. And here in hybrid, it's labeled, where is it? Here, Talkbox. So I'm going to go over all these parameters in just a second. Just let me quickly set the depth here to 0. Now, a Formant filter is a filter, just like your low-pass filter, your high-pass filter, your bell filters, notches, band passes, all those filter types we're all familiar with. And the Formant filter is just one of them, and it's a very special one because it filters out certain frequency ranges, and the resulting sound it's a bit like a vowel, And that's why this parameter right here, that's the most important one, is labeled vowel. And if I click on it, you can see that right now it's set to E. So I'm going to play a note and I'm going to play around with this parameter so you can hear all the different vowels we're able to create. Sounds a bit like a vowel, right? So that's the first thing. If you have a different Formant filter, it might be labeled differently, but if you play around with your parameters, you will for sure find the most important one. So that's cool and all, but if we just set it and forget it, like this, it just changed our basic sound from before, but it didn't add any movement, which is what we want, right? Like, this sounded very cool when I was playing around with it. So what we need to do is we need to modulate this parameter. And we can do so using either an envelope, just like the one we used before, remember? And, oops, let's get back to the effects tab here. And that would be these three parameters right here. These represent a very, very simplified envelope with just the attack time and the release time. And of course, how much we want to modulate the vowel parameter. So if I set this to 100%, then the vowel parameter will go all the way to the top. And how long it takes it to go to the top is set by the attack time. And once it reaches the top, it will go back down to where it started from. And how quickly it does so is determined by the release parameter. So I'm gonna play a note here. As you can see, it quickly went to the top, it quickly went back down, and then it stayed there. So that's not the kind of modulation we want. We don't want something that just quickly happens and then stops. We want something smoother but more continuous. So I'm going to set the envelope modulation here to 0. So we're bypassing this very simple envelope here. And we can now focus on these two parameters. Now these two are an LFO. And an LFO is exactly what we're looking for, something that modulates our parameter over time continuously. So the depth, of course, determines how much modulation is applied. So if I set this to 100%, it's going to go all the way to the top and then back down again. And how quickly it does so is determined by the rate parameter. So let's set this to something extreme to give you an idea. Okay, now that's way too much over the top here, but you get the idea. The modulation is continuous, you know, it doesn't just happen once and then it stops. We just need to get something a little more conservative. Let's set this to around here. Now that sounds about right. So what we're looking for here is, you know, a way to make our sound more organic, more interesting, to add some movement, you know, add some texture, but not something that is so extreme that the effect kind of becomes the main focus and takes over from the sound itself, you know? So it's a subtle modulation that makes it more interesting, but it doesn't distract. That's the point. We don't want it to be distracting. Yeah, we still have one parameter to look at. It's the mix parameter. Pretty self-explanatory, actually. If we set this to 0, then none of our Formant filter effect is going to be applied to the signal. If we set this back to 100%, all the way up, then all of our signal, all of our sawtooth waveform is going to be affected by the Formant filter. So that's about it for the filter. We can now move on to the third section, which is going to be, of course, the most fun part, because we're going to use an amp simulator. And again, if you don't have this built into your synth, don't worry, you can just use an external plugin. And if you're going to go third party, then I would suggest checking out IK Multimedia's Amplitube. I've used it in the past, it's just fantastic. It comes for free. You can purchase some extra amp models and stomp boxes if you need to, but in the freeware version you already have a lot of toys to play with. So that's a good one. Native Instruments has one as well. It's called Guitar Rig. Same principle, you get a free version and you can expand it. I've used that as well. It's easy to use, sounds great. I'm not being paid, of course, by these companies to say so. It's just those are the two ones I used in the past, so I know how they sound and I feel like I can safely recommend them. But anyway, you know me, if I can get the sound I want with just one plugin, I'm gonna go down that route. So I'm using Hybrid's built-in amp simulator. Now let's have a look at these parameters here and what they do. The mix knob, same as before, we're gonna leave it set to 100%. I'm gonna turn down the volume actually, because since we're distorting the signal, we're adding quite a bit of gain. So I don't want to clip my channel here. Now, let's have a look at the model parameter. And as you can see down here, we have many different amp models we can choose from. We have an AC amp. So, you know, they've emulated many different amps, but I think the one that works best with this kind of sound is a 4-cone amp. So I'm gonna leave it set to that. Next we have our drive setting. This is just like on a real amp, you know? If you're familiar with those, you probably have an input knob or a drive knob. We can apply a generous amount of drive here. Don't shy away. If the sound needs it, then just do it. That sounds about right. Feedback. Now this makes for some very realistic guitar feedback, harmonic weirdness sort of effect. So I'm gonna let you guys be the judges. You know, sounds great, sounds very realistic, like when you have a guitar and you put it close to an amp and you get that sort of feedback going on. I might play around with this in the future actually, maybe map it to a knob or a fader on my controller so I can, you know, activate it when I feel it's needed. But for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to leave this set to 0 because we want something that is more consistent and not as fuzzy and random as feedback. Next we have our treble parameter, and this one is very useful if you're working in context of a mix. So say you had some drums and bass and I don't know, guitar, vocals, synth pads, many different sounds going on, and your fake guitar sound, the one we're working on, might get a little buried in the mix. In that case, you can play around with this treble parameter here, because it's gonna make the sound way more aggressive. It's gonna boost, just like on a real amp, you know, you turn that knob and you boost the high frequencies. Way more present, way more aggressive. So I don't think we need a treble boost on this kind of sound. If anything, a cut maybe, because I think it has a little too much high frequency content. But then we have this mode parameter, which is very weird to me. As you can see, you can set it to stereo or mono. Those are the only two settings really. And listen to the difference. I mean, it doesn't really add to the depth, to the stereo width. Even when it's set to stereo, it sounds very dead center to me. So the only difference here I can perceive is a different kind of mid-range and maybe less high frequencies in mono as opposed to stereo. And you know what? I kind of prefer the mono setting. This sounds more like an actual e-guitar to me. A little too muffled maybe, but then again we have our treble knob, so we can turn up the treble a bit. Okay, around the 50% mark it starts getting a little too aggressive to me, so I'm gonna back it down a bit. Somewhere around 30%, 33, 40 as well. That kind of works for me, so that's it for the amp part of our sound. So again, choose the model you prefer, crank up the drive, and dial in the right amount of treble for the mix you're working on. So that's about it for this part. Now, the sound is cool and everything, but we need more space, we need more depth. And we can do that with something like reverb or delay. And I've used up all my available insert slots, so all 2 of them. But as you can see down here, we have some master effects as well. And those are a chorus, a reverb, and a delay. So I'm gonna use the delay for this tutorial. set the mix now all the way up to 100%. I'm just gonna crank up the delay send all the way to 100% so we can work on our delay here, and then I'm gonna scale it back a bit. And again, as always, if your synth doesn't have a delay effect built into it, you can just use an external one on your track. You can even create a send return configuration. You're free to do as you please. So this parameter right here, it's not even important. I haven't seen many delays that even have it. So if your delay doesn't have it, then so much the better. Just for reference, I think cross swaps the channels. So the left channel of our sound feeds into the right channel of the delay effect, and the right channel of our sound goes into the left channel of the delay effect. I honestly don't know why I would want to do that, so I'm just going to leave this set to dual. Now moving on, the important parameters are the time for both the left and the right channel, and the feedback, again, for the left and the right channel. Now, why is it important to have two separate time controls? Well, listen to what happens if we set both the left and the right channel to the same value. 1/4 triplet. So you hear the delay, but it's as dead center as the dry signal, which makes it kind of pointless to use a delay, you know? The purpose of the whole thing here was to get more stereo width. So we're gonna offset the right channel just a tiny bit and listen to the difference. Now we have the kind of depth we're looking for. So next comes the feedback, and I think it's easier to explain if I set it to 0. We just get one tap. So if I set this all the way up to, I don't know, 60, 70%, we get multiple taps that fade out over time. So this makes for a more natural effect. So we're gonna leave it at that. And then these last two parameters aren't as important. They are basically a low pass filter, which just affects the delayed signal, not your main signal, and a high pass filter as well. So let me set the low pass filter all the way up to 100%. Hear how muffled the delayed signal gets. Now that might be useful in certain scenarios, but me personally, in my experience with this kind of sound, I kind of want that high frequency energy to be present on the delayed signal as well. So I'm gonna set this to a very low value, if at all. I can leave it at 0 as well. So the delayed signal now has the same amount of high frequency content as the dry signal. What we can do is use a high pass filter to cut out the lows. Now this is an extreme setting. That's way too much. Let's scale it down a bit. That sounds about right. So now that we have our settings in place the way we want them to, and again, the important point here is to have a different delay time for the left and the right channel. Just set them off ever so slightly to get a wide stereo image. So now that we've done that, we can scale back the delay here a bit because it's way too loud. And again, how much of your signal you want to send to the delay depends on the material you're working with. So in this case, I don't have any other sounds going on, so I can keep this rather low. But if I had a busy mix with bass, synth pads, vocals, whatever, I would probably crank it up a bit for it not to get buried in the mix. So this is our sound really. Now if you wanted to make it even more expressive, then I would definitely suggest using some vibrato as well. So in my case, I have to switch over to the mod pane here. I can select that I want to modulate the pitch, and the source of the modulation is going to be my first LFO, so this one down here. And the depth, not too much. Let's hear what this sounds like. Okay, make the LFO a little quicker. And of course, we don't want that kind of modulation being present all the time, so let's modulate how much the modulation is being applied with our mod wheel. So if you have a MIDI controller, you probably have at least two wheels. One is the pitch bend wheel, the one that snaps back to the middle after you moved it around. And then you have the modulation wheel. So when the wheel is set to 0, then no vibrato is happening. Whereas when it's set all the way up, then we have a vibrato effect. So I need to set this to 100%, and now modulation wheel is done at 0. Now slowly turning up the wheel. So that's very handy because you can decide to apply vibrato to long held notes, but when you're doing a quick scale or sweep or whatever, you can just forget about it, set the wheel to 0, and it's gonna sound way cleaner and much tighter. So that's one thing. And then one last thing that I love to use in my solos is this shape parameter right here. And of course it might be labeled differently on the synth you're using. Just look for something like sync. How to implement it might be different. So I would suggest you check the manual of your software synth, and it sounds something like this. So it's kind of similar to the feedback parameter we had right here, which is why I think I'm going to start playing around with the feedback parameter as well. But up until now, I've only been using the shape parameter, and I have assigned it to a knob or fader on my controller so that I can only put it in when I feel it's needed, because you don't want to play like this all the time. Sounds just weird. You want your standard sound. And then when you think it's most appropriate, you can just use some of it. So yeah, those are two extra things. So again, number one, modulation. Have some vibrato and make sure you can control the amount of vibrato with the modulation wheel. And then same goes for the shape or sync parameter. So that's it really. We have our new guitar sound here. So there you have it. This is my solo sound. If there's anything I didn't explain well enough, just leave a comment and I'll try to clarify as best I can. And as always, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you like these videos, and I'll see you on the next one. Take care.